science or history, which is provable? Or perhaps we should say more provable. This is an interesting question because it points to a common cultural assumption that when it comes to proving something, history cannot be known with the kind of certainty that we attribute to scientific facts. That which is scientific carries within it a greater ability to verify itself as opposed to things that are non-scientific. And so this is an area where I think we need to do some work. This is part of the broader groundwork for reasonable arguments for the Christian faith. Since everything that we will talk about with unbelievers will necessarily circle back to history, then this is going to be a problem we've got to learn to overcome. Science or history, which is more provable? So, on October the 31st of 2016, National Geographic published an article bearing the headline, "Unsealing of Christ's Reputed Tomb Turns Up New Revelations." Now, National Geographic writer Kristen Romey chronicled the exhibition, bringing it to light. The project successfully essentially exposed to plain sight the empty tomb within which 2,000 years ago the body of Christ had been laid. So this really was a very fascinating undertaking. Now, the full project is said to have lasted some 60 hours. The work crew had dispatched from the University of Athens. Essentially, this was the same team that had undertaken the restoration of the Acropolis some years ago. Well, upon opening the ossuary, archaeologist Fred Hebert said, quote, "We can't say 100%, but it appears that the tomb is not shifted." Popular Jewish paper, the Haaretz, likewise commented that the marble slab covering the cave had now been safely removed. Israeli news contributor Nir Hassan stated that the holy site was exposed to, quote, 1 billion Christians across the globe. Well, the momentous discovery therefore seemed to contradict certain earlier claims regarding another noted religious finding. In 2007, blockbuster director James Cameron, a la the Titanic, had filmed what he believed were the genuine burial remains of Jesus. Partner documentarian Simcha Yakobovich revealed the questionable evidence before a wide-eyed watching world. Time magazine later called the discovery, quote, "debatable conjecture," for which reason the article ended with the words, "Your move, Mr. Titanic." Well, it's no great secret such discoveries are held today in suspicion. Many question how it can be known that these discoveries are, in fact, trustworthy and genuine. Indeed, National Geographic itself candidly admits, quote, "It is archaeologically impossible to say that the tomb is the burial site of Jesus." A lengthy list of Catholic relics, of course, furthers the case for doubt. Skepticism of venerated objects is, after all, centuries old, correct? As the reformer Martin Luther once said, quote, "It is claimed that the head of the Baptist lies in Rome, although history shows that John's grave was burned into powder." So that's a problem, isn't it? If we're claiming we've got the head of John the Baptist and yet his tomb was incinerated, we know that Rome is lying, correct? So for this reason, it actually might surprise some that this famous Catholic site actually carries exactly the kinds of claims that Martin Luther himself might have demanded. The tomb was recently reopened in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has long been known to attract pilgrims who would frequent its location. According to trusted Roman historian Eusebius of Caesarea, the Emperor Hadrian buried Jesus' tomb in the 2nd century. Now, he did it to strangle belief in Jesus' resurrection, which had begun to spread throughout the empire and thus threatening the Roman peace. Many of us, of course, are familiar from our history classes with the concept of Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Their idea of peace, of course, to any who would insurge against them is that they would go and plunder the city, throw it down to the ground, tear all of its stones and timber to pieces, and then sow salt into the fields. That is the concept of Roman peace. So if you want to have peace, just kill everything.
Sounds like ISIS peace.
Sounds like ISIS. But of course, Hadrian's actions succeeded in doing nothing of the sort. Instead, the location of the tomb would continue to be known for centuries. And this is very, very fascinating. Amazingly, we're told that although burying the tomb could have eternally obscured its locale, that Hadrian chose to erect a temple to Aphrodite in its place. Years later, when Emperor Constantine turned to Christ, his mother actually sought to learn the location of the tomb which had previously held Jesus' body for 3 days and 3 nights. Well, when she traveled to Jerusalem and asked the locals where the location of the tomb was, everyone said, "That's easy." And they all pointed to Aphrodite's temple. And so for this reason, as Rome turned to Christ, the temple of Aphrodite was absolutely torn down. And of course, the tomb was re-excavated. And the location of this is, can you take your guess where the location is now today? It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Amazing. Well, such an astonishing history seems to verify the find, a point which former city archaeologist Dan Bachat was ultimately forced to concede. He openly admitted, by the way with little qualification, quote, "We really have no reason to reject the authenticity of the site. So, even though you can't archaeologically prove that this is the genuine tomb of Jesus, on historical grounds, there's really no reason to reject it." It would thus appear that the new discovery is presently incontestable. No alternative location lays a greater claim to historicity. It is quite simply an unparalleled find, possibly the grandest of the century, and a startling tip-off to the Christian faith. Amen? But that, of course, doesn't mean that the skeptic man or woman believes any of this, does it? Artifacts affirming history, in fact, they're normally very, very unpersuasive. The reasons why are not only rooted in antipathy to religion, but are also founded on the modern belief that science trumps history. Hence, convincing Martin Luther of the tomb of Jesus would be a trifle, a mere matter of furnishing a credible history for the discovery. The modern skeptic, on the other hand, is not nearly so easily persuaded. He rather insists that our proofs today be founded on science instead of history. So hopefully I've framed the problem for you effectively this morning. Well, some time ago, I happened to encounter this phony problem personally. I was speaking with a stranger in a coffee shop on the subject of the Bible's radical claims. And I had grounded my presentation on the subject of its histories, and the man suddenly objected to me, declaring, "I don't accept your proofs." While questioning the man's reasoning, I quickly gathered why he was answering him along these lines. He obviously viewed science as the only valid road to reason. So, since history fails to meet the check of empirical testability, then history as a source of knowledge is less reliable than modern science. Similarly, the man also chose to reject and lightly shun the scriptures. He denied their ability to offer facts which may be proven, for he held that all ancient texts are generally unable to properly accredit their own innermost claims. Well, unfortunately, sadly, thinking such as this is very, very common in our time. It is a byproduct of the many incredible advances in the information age. In fact, it has become so strongly believed so as to be seen as a reasonable justification for rejecting alternative forms of knowledge. So, therefore, Stephen Hawking once issued the incredible claim, quote, "Philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern science." He then went on to boldly, albeit I would say naively, declare, quote, "Scientists have become the torchbearers of discovery in the quest for knowledge." Now, I really am not forming a caricature here on this morning. I really think these kinds of statements fairly represent the norm in today's culture. They have garnered broad acceptance, earning thoroughgoing acclaim, and they arrive to us today as a throwback to an antiquated set of views, which were previously held in the earlier part of the 20th century. Prominent among them, philosopher A.J. Ayer summarized these views in his book, Language, Truth, and Logic. He later admitted that it was a, quote, young man's book. That's interesting. Written with more passion than most philosophers allow. Ayer writes, give it a listen, "We maintain that no statement which referred to a reality beyond the limits of sense experience can possibly have any literal significance, from which it follows that the laborers have been devoted to the production of nonsense. If you can't empirically test it, it must be nonsense." Now, such a bizarre outlook seems to dominate our world today. Radical uncertainty clutters every corner in view. And this is only made worse by the work of historians today, such as Hayden White, who now asserts that historical texts should be treated as literary fiction. Think about that. Historical texts should be treated as literary fiction. He actually holds that as an historian. For the same reason, philosopher Patrick Gardner once questioned, in what sense can I be said to know an event which is in principle unobservable, having vanished behind the mysterious frontier which separates the past from the present?
So you're saying because they're not able to re-examine it themselves through video or other evidence that it could be biased or false?
Just completely made up and false. Now, this is part of a larger school of thought which has become erected today called historical relativism. Historical relativism. Now, I want to say to you this morning as I continue on with this lecture, I am not an historical relativist. I rather hold to historical objectivity. I believe there really are facts that we can discover out there as we read historical texts. But this is the very thing that is being called into question today, and I lay this before us now only to show that this is actually really the way it is in institutions of higher learning. The university, more than any single institution in today's culture, is marking cultural opinion. It absolutely is, and it's setting the pace. Well, back to the conversation. Grasping the man's point, I therefore began to now seek to refute it. I challenged him to soberly consider the consequences of such an odd belief. Because the sacrificial loss of rejecting our grounds for historical knowledge would be the vast disappearance of all our antecedent histories. No one could any longer speak of our common prior beginnings with any sense of certainty. Substantive, meaningful reflection about our past would cease to betide us. Any hope of learning from our remotest mistakes would become a frivolous, vain pursuit in a bottomless kind of knowledge. I therefore question the man, if you are right, then what, sir, is history? I mean, how could we even prove, for example, that George Washington even existed? It just seems to me that if we falter knowledge of history as technically uncertain, then there is nothing left to prevent us from concluding that the past, in effect, cannot be known. Well, shockingly, the man actually conceded to my point. Without any kind of shadow of reluctance, he willingly agreed. He assented to an opinion previously held by atheist philosopher David Hume, who rejected Christianity for being less provable than the evidence for our senses. Hey, if I can't see it, why believe it? Unfortunately, and this is really the problem with this kind of thinking, the man was actually completely unaware of that there was a great hole in his understanding. He was blinded by a view of science which scientists themselves now reject. Let me say that to you again. He was blinded by a view of science that scientists themselves today reject. You see, because if disqualifying history as non-empirical were truly justifiable, then we would also have to forego trusting in science itself. Returning to Stephen Hawking in his latest book, The Theorist's Muses, quote, "Until recently, it was thought that all our knowledge of the world could be obtained through our senses. But the spectacular success of modern physics has shown that this is not true." Why? Well, perhaps the best way, I think, to demonstrate Hawking's paramount point would be just to simply sketch a simple illustration. Human beings used to believe that wind was the work of the gods, but now we understand that wind is the result of energy differentials, correct? But the concept of energy is simply a mathematical and theoretical abstraction. There is no way to actually prove that energy exists independent from our empirical observations. Therefore, the man who rejects history because it cannot be empirically or directly observed may also have to deny a number of scientific truths which many of us just simply take for granted. Take, for example, philosopher of science, Bas van Frausen. The man is considered to be today probably one of the greatest practicing philosophers of science in the world. In a September 2016 issue of the magazine Nautilus, Frausen was interviewed on the subject of science and realism. Writer Peter Byrne conducted the interview and noted one of von Frausen's most far-reaching assertions, that experimental data is, quote, nothing more than an observable fragment in a fundamentally unobservable universe. Again, what's the point? It's the very point that Hawking has made. This is the very same conclusion that Hawking himself defends, that the universe is essentially unobservable. In his own words, Hawking further writes, quote, the universe has no independent existence. In other words, it's therefore up to the scientist to simply assume that the universe exists, and this is fundamentally no different than the work of modern historians. Belief in the claims of the past is simply a rational leap of reason. It is inferred on the basis of overwhelming evidence that is gathered from universal human experience. And so therefore I urge the man to actually drop his faulty line of argument as I sat with him that day in the coffee shop. I encouraged him to let this kind of thinking go. I attempted to show that the Bible can indeed be trusted. Well, sadly, the man failed to agree with my point that science really today offers us no reason why we should say that its methodologies somehow outweigh those of modern historians. For scientific methodologies today are equally ridden with assumptions apart from which science as a discipline could not function. Those who believe otherwise do so despite the best evidence that the most current cutting-edge thinkers are now beginning to show us. And so therefore, in conclusion, I think, turning to the Bible, let's look at this for a moment. Let's look at the words of Jesus found in the fourth and final gospel of the Bible. To Nicodemus, who was an early skeptic, if you recall, this is what Jesus said to Nicodemus. The wind blows wherever it pleases, and you hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it is going. See, it's the same thing that modern science holds. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. May we therefore learn to hear these words and put our trust in them.